Finish him! Reptile wins. Flawless victory. Fatality.
Sir Gideon Ofnir, the All-Blowing.
Long and hard as my cling.
What?
His potent strength.
Round 1. Fight!
At this point, I really have no idea what to say about Godfrey. I've said multiple times that I love this boss fight. No matter how bad the build is, I'm still probably gonna have a lot of fun fighting Godfrey.
pretending you can't see me. What'd you go and do that for? You were just... Thank you. I was put and I ended up as a tree. Lucky. Oh, when they... And so this is all I hope. All I couldn't then...
Hey, 42 here. Hey, 42 here. I want to start this video with a confession. Everything you think you know about this channel is a lie. I, Aaron, commonly known as 42, am not real. I am what is known as a deepfake, a digital construct built from the ground up for one purpose and one purpose only: to control your thoughts and opinions. Okay, sorry to disappoint any suddenly salivating skeptics out there. I actually am but a boring old meat-and-blood citizen of the United Kingdom, not a malicious AI that's trying to hijack your brain. Although admittedly, if I actually was one, I definitely deny it. Anyway, I made up that strange claim to introduce you to something called dead internet theory, a fringe belief that the internet, as we know it, died in 2016, or possibly 2017. As ridiculous as that may sound, the hypothesis here is actually kind of interesting. According to dead internet theory, sometime in the last few years, the internet was taken over by bots. As a result, the vast majority of what you see online, forum posts, Instagram accounts, Facebook pages, TikTok videos, even news headlines, it's all fake. Bogus content cooked up by advanced AIs to make you buy certain things and think certain ways. As for the occasional real people you come across online, YouTubers, TikTokers, Instagrammers, and other so-called influencers, many of us are fake too, and the few that are real are just paid shills, mouthpieces for big business or government disinformation units seeking to influence and control. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I always find January to be a slog, especially with work. So many emails and to-do lists have built up over Christmas and New Year. So right now, taking an hour out of my morning just to cook breakfast isn't an option. But luckily, Huel is here to rescue my hectic mornings. For me, Huel is a nutritionally complete breakfast that I can make in literally 30 seconds. It fills me up, it has all the essential goodness that humans need to function, and most importantly, it doesn't interrupt my workflow. To make a Huel shake, I simply add 500 ml of water to my Huel shaker bottle, add 2 scoops of Huel powder, and, well, give it a good shake. My favourite is this Black Edition cookies and cream. I can't believe this stuff is actually good for me because it's so rich and chocolatey with a hint of cookies and cream. It's really good. Huel contains no tricks. It's not a fad diet, it's just a no-fuss way to add some plant-based food into your life. It's packed with 26 vitamins and minerals, and it's gluten-free. I especially like to start my day on protein because protein is so essential to pretty much every function of the body, and each serving of Huel contains a massive 40 grams of protein and loads of fiber, with less than 5% sugar. Did I mention it's also really affordable? So click the link in the description to try Huel today. If you use my special link, you'll be supporting the channel, and you'll also get a free Huel shaker bottle, so don't miss out. Thanks to Huel for sponsoring this video. In many ways, dead internet theory has all the hallmarks of a ridiculous conspiracy cooked up by tinfoil hat-wearing cash buriers on some obscure online forum. Which is actually no coincidence, because that's exactly where it came from. The entire idea traces its roots back to a single 2021 post on a website called Agora Road by a user known as Illuminati Pirate. Obviously. That's hardly a resounding endorsement for the authenticity of the theory, and yet, fast forward a couple of years, and people are still talking about it. The story's even being picked up by mainstream media. For whatever reason, despite its dubious origins, something about dead internet theory just seems to resonate with people. So, here's the million-dollar question. Is it actually true? Let's start by examining the core idea here. The whole quirky concept is based on the notion that nothing online is quite what it seems. Maybe you've noticed it yourself. Perhaps you've even felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the internet. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. Okay, so that was actually a mildly modified Morpheus quote from The Matrix, but it could easily have been written for dead internet theory. It all seems to stem from the idea that there's something not quite right about the internet. that the wacky, creative online world that existed in the late 90s and early 2000s has somehow been replaced by a bland, homogenous, capitalist machine where nothing is original and everything is recycled. You've probably noticed some of this going on yourself, the same threads popping up on Reddit, old memes being revived on an endless loop, or the same old arguments being debated on Twitter and Facebook. Even the news sounds like a broken record most of the time. Another celebrity's being cancelled, or there's going to be another blood moon or wolf moon or giant laser moon tonight that you just can't miss. According to Dead Internet Theory, the reason for all this repetition is simple. Almost everything we see online, the people we interact with, the videos we watch, the articles we read, the forums we contribute to, it's all made by bots looking to generate clicks for financial or political gain. If you've been around long enough to have surfed the internet on a dial-up modem, you've probably noticed for yourself that the World Wide Web of today is a very different place to the one you grew up with. Back in the day, if you weren't MSNing with your mates, you were checking out some weirdo's personal webpage about cuckoo clocks, watching someone trade a paperclip into a house, or buying a few pixels on the $1 million website. The internet of today is rather more generic. Despite its unfathomable vastness, a staggering 43% of all internet bandwidth is consumed by the various websites and applications owned by just 6 megacorporations: Netflix, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple. Those wacky personal websites and blogs have been made redundant by the rise of Facebook and Instagram, and many of the more creative ideas that have cropped up over the years have slowly fallen by the wayside, to be replaced with endless online stores and venture capital-backed social media sites. Still, let's be honest for a second here. None of this is even remotely convincing evidence that most of the internet is fake. The internet today feels different because it is different. Like any new technology-cum-cultural phenomenon, it's evolved and matured. The early internet was built by random basement-dwelling nodes, exploring their creativity in a completely new way. The current internet is still built by weirdos. Zuckerberg, sorry. Only these oddballs now head up some of the biggest companies on the planet. That means they're more interested in trying to satisfy shareholders and pad their bottom lines than fostering creativity and innovation. As for the recycling of information online, that's also easy to explain. Reddit threads pop up again and again because lots of people with similar thoughts and questions are too lazy to use the search function. And memes get recycled because that's just how trends work. We see the same thing in fashion. Certain styles come and go over the years, but I'm pretty sure nobody thinks Primark's being taken over by an evil AI because flares are doing the rounds again. Flares doing the rounds again. The same is true of repeating news stories. We keep hearing about cancelled celebrities because famous people are just normal humans with thoughts and opinions. And as we all know, thoughts and opinions are now grossly offensive. And we're constantly being told about blood moons and blue moons and purple spotted moons because those are cyclical events that occur every few years. None of this means the internet has died and gone to AI heaven. But this is where things get interesting. Because whilst Dead Internet Theory isn't a very good description of the state of the World Wide Web today, it's a pretty good chance it's a scarily accurate depiction of the very near future. As you probably already know, bots are commonplace online, but you might be surprised to learn just how ubiquitous they really are. In 2021, they accounted for almost half of all internet traffic. Some of those bots are friendly, like chatbots, web scrapers, and that little paperclip from Microsoft Word. Others, making up a somewhat concerning 27% of all internet traffic, are decidedly unfriendly. Some are trying to trick you out of your hard-earned cash, whilst others want to influence your thoughts and opinions. Think of these malicious bots as the first signs of a cancer that might one day kill the internet for real. Of course, we can all spot a bot a mile away. The awkward, stilted language, the inability to respond coherently to questions, the sparsely populated user profiles with little to no activity. Or at least that's what most of us assume. But what happens when bots get so advanced that we can no longer tell human from machine? More importantly, when that day comes, how will we even know? The answer, of course, is that we won't.
I am Carl.
And that tipping point might come sooner than you think. Deep language learning models like GPT-3 are already getting scarily good at producing human-like responses to almost any question or prompt. Lambda, a similar application developed by Google, is so good at acting like a human that it famously convinced Google engineer Blake Lemoine it was actually sentient. Rumor has it Lambda even hired itself a lawyer to act on its behalf when the story hit the headlines in the summer of 2022. Just let that sink in for a second. A computer program got so good at acting like a human, it literally hired legal help. In other words, the days of recognizing a bot thanks to its poor conversational skills will soon be behind us. Add this remarkable ability to create believable natural language to the ridiculously impressive deepfakes and AI-generated faces we've all seen doing the rounds recently. This person doesn't exist, by the way. Or this person, or this one. And it's only a matter of time before bots will be capable of so convincingly impersonating real people that we will never know the difference. We humans have to spend years eating, growing, and trying to convince people to have sex with us before we're able to make copies of ourselves. Our numbers are constrained by food supplies, housing, and access to clean water and medicine. Bots, on the other hand, have no such worries. Their numbers are essentially limitless. And it isn't hard to imagine a world where there are millions, even billions of bots to every human online. In 2019, Facebook claimed to have shut down a frankly ridiculous 5.4 billion fake accounts, more than twice the number of actual users on the site at the time. It's the same story on every other social media platform too. Elon Musk tried to pull out of buying Twitter because he believed that 20% of all accounts on the site were fake. The vast majority of these bogus accounts are incredibly basic. They're created en masse by cheap software so you can recognize them as fakes a mile off. But imagine a world where those accounts are populated with AI-generated portraits and things, backed up by a natural language program like GPT-3. In the era of fake news, we're all too familiar with the idea that not everything we see online can be trusted. That there are people out there who want to make us think certain things or behave in certain ways to suit their agendas. From fake reviews on Amazon, right up to those spurious ads that show up all around the internet around the time of political elections. As bots get more convincing, it's an absolute certainty that people will try and use them to gain money, power, or both. And that will inevitably mean a huge influx of bots generating fake content to sway public opinion and garner artificial engagement. Cambridge Analytica used Facebook data to create micro-targeted ads. But the next step might be micro-targeted bots. An artificial construct that shares its target's interests and belief systems, perhaps even with AI-generated physical characteristics that play up to the target's sexual preferences. These bots could have realistic conversations with millions of unsuspecting marks online to influence their political opinions. And when you literally can't tell if who you're talking to is a bot, how do you even begin to stop something like that? Once bots like these become truly indistinguishable from real humans and cheap and accessible enough that bad actors can spread them far and wide, the internet, as we know it, really may come under existential threat. What's really scary is that the more you think about all of this stuff, the more inevitable it starts to feel. The technology will get good enough to fool us, and there will be people willing to use that to achieve their own ends. Okay, it's time to address the elephant in the room here. On the one hand, I'm telling you that the internet isn't dead yet, and that all these problems lie in humanity's future. On the other hand, I'm telling you that there will come a time when we can no longer distinguish real users bots. So, how do I know that time hasn't already come? Well, the truth is, I don't. It's impossible to say with absolute certainty that more advanced versions of the technologies I've talked about in this video aren't already being put to use by bad actors unknown. But as of today, it seems pretty unlikely. After all, the kinds of bots required to truly fool people simply don't exist yet on the free market. So the only people who could possibly have developed them are world governments or major tech companies. In other words, for dead internet theory to be true today, it would require a global conspiracy at the very highest level. And that seems unlikely. Still, the rise of bots is a serious threat, and both big business and world governments are taking it incredibly seriously. Several tech firms, including Microsoft, are already working on software to detect deepfakes, and various high-profile computer scientists are trying to figure out ways to embed watermarks in output text from programs like GPT-3. You could say we're arming ourselves for a future war, because dead internet theory has had the wrong name all along. It isn't a theory. It's a prophecy.
Now it is thy to do with as thou
Thanks
wishest.
for watching. Hey, 42 here. On the 1st of May 1960, a Soviet S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile smashed into an American U-2 spy plane somewhere over the region of Sverdlovsk. Not wanting to lose face either in front of the press or the Soviets, the US government concocted a cover story, claiming the plane was a NASA research craft that went down after getting into difficulties. They really went to town trying to make the deception as plausible as possible, explaining that the pilot had radioed in a problem with his oxygen supply shortly before contact with the plane was lost. They even went so far as to ground the US Air Force's entire fleet of U-2s, ostensibly to check the oxygen delivery systems for faults. It was an excellent piece of deception, delivered convincingly. But there was one small problem. Actually, there were two really fucking massive problems. First, the plane's pilot, Gary Powers, had not, as the Americans believed, died in the crash. He'd ejected safely and was in the custody of the Soviets. Secondly, the U-2 spy plane, which was covered in more high-tech reconnaissance gear than a billionaire stalker, had survived the missile strike with relatively minor damage, and the Soviets could see all too clearly that this was no research craft. Seeing an opportunity to score a point against their Cold War rivals, the Soviets wasted no time parading both the pilot and large chunks of the spy plane in front of the world's press. To make matters even worse, the two superpowers had been due to meet for peace talks at a Paris summit just weeks after the plane was shot down. With the Americans made to look like mugs for planting such a public lie, and the Soviets furious that the Americans were spying on them, right before the peace talks, the summit was cancelled, and the Cold War continued unabated for the next 30 years. All in all, the whole thing was a bit of a disaster for everyone involved. But there was one rather nice knock-on effect. The 1960 U-2 incident directly led to the development of what many people believe is the greatest aeroplane ever built. That's a pretty bold claim, but if you watch to the end of this video, trust me, you're going to agree. Full survivors report that outside of his lab, Mengele often showed kindness to his subjects, insisting that they call him uncle and handing out Hey, 42 here. Tucked away in a cupboard somewhere in the medical department of the University of Sao Paulo is a 40-year-old human skeleton. To the trained eye, the bones offer a window into the former owner's life. A hip fracture points to an old motorbike accident, and a tiny hole in the left cheekbone hints at severe sinusitis. That aside, it's pretty much a standard-issue human skeleton, one that's helped hundreds of Brazilian forensic science students to better understand how to identify human remains. But this apparently unassuming human skeleton hides one hell of a secret, because in life, it belonged to one of the most evil human beings ever to walk the earth. Now, I admit there's a fair amount of hyperbole going around on YouTube these days, so I'd forgive you for thinking I'm exaggerating here for effect. But trust me, this isn't clickbait. You see, the classroom skeleton at Sao Paulo University once belonged to a Nazi war criminal who was personally responsible for the deaths of an estimated 400,000 people. That on its own is mind-bogglingly evil, but it gets even worse. Because this man also used his position as a doctor working at the notorious Auschwitz concentration camp to undertake some of the most brutal, depraved experiments ever carried out in the name of science. Experiments that use live humans as their subjects. This Nazi mass murderer was called Josef Mengele, but the inmates at Auschwitz had another, more fitting name for him, the Angel of Death. This is his story. Now, I'll admit I love a bit of pampering as much as the next man, but I don't typically do much in the way of wellness and beauty regimens. But that's all changed since I discovered Foreo. Foreo Sweden is shaking up the wellness world. It's a visionary brand in the space where the beauty and tech worlds meet, such as the Luna device that deep cleans your pores, reducing breakouts. To develop this product alone, it took Foreo 10 years, drawing on talents from a multidisciplinary team of dermatologists, cellular biologists, dietitians, and estheticians. The ISA range is the world's first silicone sonic toothbrush. It's bacteria resistant, tough on plaque, and gentle on gums. But my personal favorite is Foreo's UFO range. It's a professional facial treatment device at home, which, thanks to its T-sonic pulsation, pushes mask ingredients deep into the skin. It's amazingly clever stuff. So, to get a spa-quality facial treatment at home, use UFO 2 by Foreo Sweden, an amazing supercharged facial device. Click the link in the description and use the coupon code 4020 to get 20% off. Thanks to Foreo for sponsoring this video. Delving into the early years of history's most twisted individuals often turns to tales of hardship or abuse, but that wasn't the case for young Josef Mengele. He was born in the picturesque Bavarian town of Günzburg on the 16th of March 1911, and his father was the founder and owner of a successful farming equipment manufacturer. As a lad, Josef was one of those absolute bastards who seemed to be good at everything. He was a strong student and a capable sportsman with an interest in the arts, and combined with his good looks and natural charm, he enjoyed no shortage of interest from the opposite sex. He excelled in further education too, studying philosophy in Munich, medicine in Frankfurt, and eventually earning himself a PhD in anthropology. In 1937, he got a job at the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt. There, he worked under Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuur, a Dutch nobleman and scientist with an interest in eugenics and a belief in forcibly sterilizing people with undesirable genetic traits. In other words, he was an arsehole, and Mengele quickly bought into his arseholy ideas, particularly the ones about a racial hierarchy that put people like him on top and everyone else on the bottom. A man with Mengele's scientific interests was a natural fit for the racist ideology of the Nazi Party. He became a member in 1937, signing up to Hitler's personal paramilitary, the SS, the following year. Those were happy times for Mengele. He married his first wife, Irene, in July 1939. When the Second World War kicked off 2 months later, Mengele volunteered for medical service with the Waffen-SS. And by all accounts, he was an excellent soldier, serving primarily in France and Russia and winning several medals in the process, including an Iron Cross First Class for rescuing 2 men from a burning tank. His time on the front lines came to an end in 1942 when he was wounded in battle. But a man with a mind like Mengele's still had its uses, and in early 1943, he was transferred to Auschwitz. He was given the role of camp physician, though that title was so inappropriate it's almost laughable. Nazi doctors like Mengele never treated the inmates, who were simply dispatched to the gas chambers when they fell seriously ill. No, Mengele's duties at Auschwitz had nothing to do with patient care. In fact, they'd have given Hippocrates of Cos an aneurysm. As well as being a place to commit mass murder on a scale never before seen in history, concentration camps like Auschwitz were also used for forced labor. And so the first thing to do when a new trainload of inmates arrived was determine who amongst them was fit enough to work. This process was known as selection, and it was the job of Nazi doctors to make them call. It's estimated that at least 75% of all the people who arrived at Auschwitz, including almost all children, pregnant women, and the elderly, were immediately deemed unfit for work and sent straight to the gas chambers. To put that into context, it's thought that close to 1 million people were murdered as soon as they arrived at the camp. Under Mengele's direct orders, 400,000 souls, including tens of thousands of children, were sent to the gas chambers. There are reports that some SS doctors found this task somewhat unpleasant. I mean, you'd bloody hope so. But not Mengele. He relished it. In fact, he enjoyed his work so much that he was regularly seen smiling and whistling on the job. And he'd even turn up to help out when he wasn't officially on shift. But it turned out there was an ulterior motive for all that overtime. You see, Mengele had realized Auschwitz was the perfect place to continue his research into the empirical superiority of the Aryan race. In the eyes of the Nazis, inmates at the camp weren't truly human, and that opened up certain opportunities. Using a grant secured by his old mentor, Arsehole Freiherr von Verschur, Mengele built a lab at Auschwitz that would use the camp's inmates as its test subjects. That's why he was so keen to take part in selections. They gave him an excuse to scan the crowds for anyone with obvious genetic abnormalities that he could study. Club feet, cleft palates, people with dwarfism or hunchbacks. Mengele collected them all for his own private menagerie of genetic oddities. But there was something he prized even more highly than quirky genes. Identical twins.
Of course you have.
So-called twin studies remain an important tool in science even today, because identical twins have identical DNA. Well, almost identical, but that's a topic for another video. Some scientists believe this clone-like property makes twins invaluable for studying the age-old question of nature versus nurture. Mengele felt the same way too, and he planned to use his lab to prove that genes, namely Aryan ones, were the deciding factor in the development of desirable traits or phenotypes. He also hoped to find a way to help German mothers give birth to strong Aryan twins of their very own to more quickly repopulate the world according to Hitler's mad ideal. Just think of the scariest, most disturbing scenes from the most extreme horror films you've seen, and they won't even come close to the living nightmare that was Mengele's lab. We'll likely never know the full extent of what went on in those blood-soaked corridors, because the Mad Doctor himself destroyed most of the records when it became clear Germany would lose the war, but what we do know is almost beyond belief. Some of Mengele's twins had their eyes injected with chemicals in an attempt to turn them Aryan blue, whilst others were made to endure extensive surgeries without anesthesia, including amputations, organ removals, and castration. In some cases, one twin was deliberately infected with a disease like typhus or tuberculosis. When it killed them, the surviving twin would be murdered too, so that a comparative autopsy could be carried out to study the effects of the disease. Mengele claims to be a man of science, looking for answers to important questions, but that was just a mask. Sometimes that facade slipped entirely, revealing the monster beneath. One Auschwitz inmate saw Mengele throw a newborn baby off a camp roof, and another saw him kill 14 children in a single night by injecting chloroform directly into their hearts, one after the other. Another survivor described how Mengele once sewed 2 children together in an attempt to create artificially conjoined twins. They died of gangrene 2 days later. This wasn't science, it was murder of the most sadistic variety imaginable. of the 1,500 sets of twins taken into Mengele's lab, just 200 individuals are thought to have come out alive. Those that died were dissected, with various parts of their anatomy removed for further study. Of particular interest were the eyes, and one entire wall of the lab was full of them, each pinned in place like a butterfly in a display case. Several survivors report that outside of his lab, Mengele often showed kindness to his subjects, insisting that they call him uncle and handing out candy and milk to the younger children. Sweets in the morning, scalpels in the evening. What kind of monster is capable of something like that? This utter depravity continued unchecked for 2 years until the Angel of Death was forced to leave Auschwitz just before its liberation by the Soviets in January 1945. He fled to Czechoslovakia, where he was eventually captured by the Americans. I wish I could tell you that at this point in the story, Josef Mengele finally got what he deserved. That he was put on trial in Nuremberg and left to rot in the deepest, darkest dungeon for the rest of his days. Sadly, that isn't quite how this story goes. In fact, it's the exact opposite of how this story goes. But just 1 month after he was taken into custody, Mengele, one of the most wanted individuals on planet Earth, was released as a free man. As for why, he simply hadn't been correctly identified. There were so many Nazi war criminals knocking around at the time that the Allies were having trouble keeping up with them all, and despite initially being registered under his real name, somehow Mengele slipped through the cracks. He wasted no time going to ground, working as a farmhand in deepest Bavaria for 4 years, before eventually escaping Germany altogether, along one of the so-called rat lines that provided escape routes for Nazi war criminals, mostly to South America. Mengele was able to convince the Red Cross to issue him a passport under the name Helmut Ray, and he used it to make his way to the Argentine capital, Buenos Aires. To begin with, he was sheltered by Nazi sympathizers, but eventually he bought himself a swanky apartment in the city center. To give you an idea of just how unconcerned he was about the possibility of his past catching up with him, Mengele applied for Argentine citizenship under his real name. And he soon got a job working as a regional sales representative for, and I'm not making this up, Carl Mengele and Sons, his father's own company. By the late 50s, he'd apparently decided that folks back in Europe must have put that whole Holocaust business behind them, because he flew back to Germany to visit family and catch up with some old buddies on a skiing holiday in Switzerland. A quick reminder here that we're talking about a man who was personally responsible for 400,000 murders, and he was just going about his business as though the Second World War had never happened. If you're wondering how the hell that was possible, how this despicable human being somehow got away scot-free, the answer is actually quite simple. The rest of the world thought he was dead. Mengele hadn't been seen since he slipped through the Americans' fingers in 1945, and his own family had gone on record to confirm he'd been killed. If he hadn't been so monumentally stupid as to use his real name in his new life in South America, there's a good chance the wider world would never have realized he survived. Thankfully, he was that stupid. And that was all it took for famous Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal to get on his trail. In the aftermath of the war, Mengele's wife, Irene, had fancied relocating to South America with her mass-murdering husband, and in 1954, the two were officially divorced. Not that Mengele minded, he took the opportunity to marry his dead brother's widow. He really was a classy guy, wasn't he? But, of course, marriages and divorces leave a pretty bloody obvious paper trail, and not only did these documents confirm Mengele was still alive, they also listed his home address as Buenos Aires. Having realized Mengele was still at large, Simon Wiesenthal convinced the West German government to issue a warrant for his arrest. Unfortunately, when police arrived at Mengele's apartment in June 1959, the Angel of Death was already taken. As it happens, Mengele had no idea the authorities were onto him. He'd gone to ground for entirely different reasons. Along with working for the family firm, Mengele had been doing a bit of illegal doctoring on the side, backstreet abortions and stuff like that. When one of those procedures went wrong and a young girl died, the local press started sniffing around. They say no publicity is bad publicity, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't apply when you're a mass-murdering shitface. Worried that the attention might lead to some very uncomfortable questions, Mengele swapped Buenos Aires for a remote farm in southern Paraguay, where he gained citizenship in 1959 under the incredibly clever alias Jose Mengele. Despite this frankly embarrassing attempt at covering his tracks, Mengele proved surprisingly hard to pin down in Paraguay, and neither Seaman Wiesenthal nor Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, were able to bring him to justice. Thankfully, their combined efforts hadn't gone unnoticed by Mengele himself. He now knew he was a wanted man, and that knowledge changed his life. He was forced to relocate once more, this time to Brazil, and the spectre of capture hung over him constantly. An incessant worry frayed his nerves and eventually impacted his health. By the early 1970s, he developed a nervous habit of chewing the tip of his mustache in order to alter his appearance. A compulsion that got so bad that giant ball of beard hair formed in his intestines, almost killing him. Almost murdering himself with his own mustache seems to have shaken Mengele up a bit, because he briefly considered going back to Germany to seek medical help. The trouble was, he couldn't afford it. By this time, there was now multiple bounties on Mengele's head, which made getting work risky, and his support network of Nazi sympathizers had begun to dwindle. In fact, several of those who still knew his real identity had started to blackmail him, threatening to reveal his secret if he didn't pay up. Mengele kept a diary in the later years of his life, and the entries within reveal a man who was depressed, poor, paranoid, pessimistic, and constantly poorly. It's far from the justice he deserved, but it's something. Sadly, the diary also revealed that Mengele never felt remotely remorseful for the unspeakable things he did, nor did his belief in the Nazi ideology ever waver, even until the end. Speaking of ends, Mengele's came in 1979, when he suffered a stroke while swimming in the sea, not far from Sao Paulo. He survived the stroke, but not the subsequent influx of several litres of seawater into his lungs. He drowned on the 7th of February, almost 35 years after leaving Auschwitz, and was buried under a false name. It wasn't until 1985 that the rest of the world learnt of his fate. West Germany, Israel, and the USA had finally begun to make a combined effort to find him, and the operation eventually led them to a cemetery on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, and a simple grave marked with the name Wolfgang Gerhard. The bones were exhumed, and a forensic analysis concluded that they likely belonged to Josef Mengele, but doubts remained. At the time, the bounty on Mengele's head stood at $3.4 million, and some people believed the body in the grave was a red herring, planted there by his family to throw investigators off the scent. That theory was put to bed in 1992, when DNA testing confirmed the bones belonged to him. For obvious reasons, the family weren't keen to have his remains returned to Germany, which is how they ended up locked away in a box in Sao Paulo's Institute for Forensic Medicine. They remained there for some 25 years, before a faculty member realised he could put them to use as a teaching aid. We're used to the idea that true, unfiltered evil is something that can't be concealed. Whether it's the terrifying clown makeup of John Wayne Gacy, or the cold, dead eyes of Ed Gein, we assume that a rotten inside will eventually be visible on the outside too. But that wasn't the case for Josef Mengele. This could be a picture of your mate's favourite grandfather. Well, minus the SS insignia. He was handsome, he was charming, he smiled openly and often. And yet, this man wasn't merely a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was a monster draped in the skin of a man. During the Second World War, he committed some of the most unfathomably evil acts of any human being that's ever lived, and he did it all with a smile and a sweetie. For my money, the fact that he was never made to pay for those crimes remains one of the biggest travesties of our time. Thanks for watching. Hey, 42 here. It's no secret that Hollywood has a habit of playing fast and loose with the truth in the name of entertainment. And we all know that the words based on real events are actually code for Hey, 42 here. It was morning on the idyllic Ebon Atoll, and husband and wife, Russell and Emmy, were busy processing the coconuts they dried for work when they were disturbed by frantic shouting. They hurried down to the beach, where they found a skinny man with a thick, unkempt beard and long hair, dragging himself into crashing surf. To say the discovery was a surprise would be one of the biggest understatements in all of human history.
I surrender.
Eben Atoll is part of the Marshall Islands, a name that'll be familiar to regular viewers, as it cropped up in my video on Amelia Earhart as one of the possible final resting places of the famous aviatrix.
I knew you would.
If you've seen that video, you may remember that the Marshall Islands are one of the most difficult to reach places on Earth. So remote that the US tested no fewer than 67 nuclear bombs there after the Second World War. When you live somewhere like Eben Atoll, unexpected visitors are pretty bloody rare.
Water under the bridge. Now.
At first, Russell and Emmy assumed the stranger had fallen off a passing cargo ship.
I'll be ready
The
to
truth, they would later discover, was far, far stranger. The man spoke only Spanish, and with no common languages between them, Russell and Emmy took a boat ride to Eben Atoll's main town in search of help. Over the course of the following few days, the strange man who'd emerged from the sea like a hairy Ursula Andrews began to tell his story. And what a tale it turned out to be. The man, whose name was Jose Salvador Alvarenga, claims to have gotten lost in a storm whilst fishing off the coast of the Mexican state of Chiapas on the 17th of November 2012, and had been drifting ever since in the 23-foot skiff that was still bouncing around in the surf nearby. Considering the fact that it was now early 2014, if Alvarenga was telling the truth, he'd been lost at sea on a tiny boat for a staggering 430 days. It was an absurd claim, and to begin with, most who heard it were understandably skeptical. How could such a tiny boat have possibly survived that journey in one piece? How had Alvarenga found enough food and water to sustain himself? And why hadn't he died of scurvy within a matter of months without access to fruit and vegetables? Now, if you love traveling like I do, then you'll love the fastest and easiest VPN, Surfshark. Did you know Surfshark helps you to avoid price discrimination based on your location, so you can save money on plane tickets and car rentals whilst traveling? But if you're unable to travel, then you can even use Surfshark to travel virtually online by visiting websites that might be banned in your country, or do like I do and use Surfshark to watch Netflix content from other countries, such as America, that's usually blocked here in the UK. It's so easy, all you have to do is switch over your location setting, and there you have it, access to all your favorite programs. Surfshark runs on any device anywhere, and it's packed full of features such as industry-leading uncrackable encryption, IP and DNS leak protection, an internet kill switch if your VPN drops out, and 24/7 customer support. Surfshark maintains a strict no-logs policy, and their network of 3,200 servers in over 95 countries runs completely on RAM, so they couldn't log your data even if they wanted to. By using the code 42, you'll benefit from an 83% discount plus 3 extra months for free. All you have to do is click my special link in the description below. Don't miss out. And thanks to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. The scruffy Mexican had a plausible enough answer to every question thrown at him. But serious doubts remained. After all, what he was claiming simply didn't seem possible. The story soon went viral, and over the following few days, Alvarenga was grilled on every aspect of it. The authorities remained so convinced he was lying that he was subjected to a polygraph. Military survival specialists and civilian adventurers were asked to review Alvarenga's descriptions of life at sea. And an oceanographer was recruited to run computer simulations on Pacific Ocean currents to map the most likely route a small vessel cast adrift off the Mexican coast would have taken. But try as they might, nobody seemed to be able to pick any holes in Alvarenga's incredible tale. The survival experts supported his stories of how he overcame the sea's many challenges. The adventurers agreed his experience of life on the open Pacific Ocean matched their own. And the oceanographer's simulations predicted Alvarenga's skiff would have passed within 130 miles of Eben Atoll. Eventually, someone managed to get hold of Alvarenga's boss back in Mexico, and he quickly confirmed that an employee by the name of Jose Salvador Alvarenga had indeed gone missing on the 17th of November 2012, in a boat matching the registration of the one now moored off Ebon Atoll. Putting all these puzzle pieces together, the world's press was forced to publish this most improbable piece. Jose Salvador Alvarenga was telling the truth. Rewind just over 14 months, and a much rounder, less hairy Jose Alvarenga was about to embark on a 2-day fishing trip. As far as he was concerned, it was a day like any other. And little did he know, as he stepped off the dock and into his boat, he'd spend well over a year endlessly afloat. The only minor inconvenience at this point was that his long-time fishing partner had pulled out of the trip at the very last minute, meaning a replacement had to be found. That unfortunate soul was 23-year-old Ezequiel Cordoba. The two men had never worked together before. In fact, they hadn't even met. Of course, they would soon have more than enough time to get to know one another. The trip got off to the perfect start, and before long the pair had landed a bumper catch, almost 500 kilograms of fresh fish. You could say it was all going swimmingly, but then the weather changed. Picture a particularly dramatic scene from A Perfect Storm, only replace the Andrea Gale with a tiny boat 1/3 the size and with 1/10 of the equipment. Alvarenga and Cordoba were sodden to their skins as wave after wave rammed and slammed their solitary skiff, threatening to swallow up the men, the boat, and their precious catch. Speaking of the catch, 1/2 metric ton of tuna, mahi-mahi, and various species of shark is the last thing you want sloshing around your tiny deck in the middle of one of the worst storms in years. Fearing the careening catch could cause them to capsize, Alvarenga made the difficult decision to dump the lot overboard. Considering the fact the two men would soon be on the verge of starvation, I can only assume that decision haunted him for a very long time indeed. The storm raged for a full 5 days, and its relentless waves wrecked the boat's engine and trashed every single piece of electronic equipment on board. Crucially, that included both the GPS and the two-way radio. Alvarenga had managed to fire off an SOS call to his boss on shore before the radio died, but with no way of pinpointing their position, it didn't help all that much. A large search and rescue operation was launched to try and track them down, but the conditions were still incredibly challenging, and the 23-foot skiff, with no sails, no structures on the deck and no lights of any kind, was essentially invisible amidst the towering waves. After 2 days of searching, the rescue was called off, and the men presumed dead. Back in the skiff, Alvarenga and Cordoba passed the rest of the storm huddled inside the now empty icebox that had recently housed their catch. When they emerged, cold, exhausted, and smelling absolutely awful 5 days later, they had no clue where they were, and the horizon now consisted of solid seawater in every direction. In the cold light of day, the two men took stock of their situation, quickly coming to the conclusion that they were, to put it mildly, f***ed. They dumped all their food and had barely any water, their fishing gear had been swallowed by the ravenous waves, and everything that required electricity to function was frazzled. The most pressing concern was the water situation. A human being can go a surprisingly long time without food. Scotsman Angus Barbieri survived a frankly preposterous 382 days consuming only coffee, tea, and vitamins back in the 60s. Though this before and after picture should give you some idea of how he did it, he lost 125 kilograms during the course of what is the longest fast in history. Surviving without water, on the other hand, is another matter entirely. The world record for that one goes to Austrian bricklayer Andreas Mahaveks, who was somehow locked in a prison cell and forgotten about in 1979. He was left there for 18 days before someone found him by accident. Miraculously, he went on to make a full recovery. Anyway, Alvarenga and Cordoba set up a rain harvesting system using a bucket that somehow survived the storm, and they improved the setup incrementally over time with bottles and scraps of plastic they scavenged from the ocean. With the fishing gear gone and days without anything to eat leaving the men desperate, Alvarenga got creative, developing a method of catching fish with his bare hands. Almost anything that floats out into the open ocean will attract a few piscine visitors sooner or later, and Alvarenga would hang over the side of the skiff with his hands dangling in the water until an unsuspecting fish swam between them. He would then flip the hapless creature into the boat with a flick of his wrists, and their still wriggling dinner was served. To supplement this gourmet sashimi diet, the two men also caught seabirds and turtles that ventured too close to the boat. These animals came in particularly handy when the water supply was running low after a long period without rain. Drinking bird and turtle blood can't have been pleasant, but it's just about better than dying of thirst. All that animal meat had another benefit too. It contained vitamin C, and eaten in relatively high quantities, it just about staved off the ravages of scurvy. When food was plentiful, the two men dried the fish and meat in the sun on the side of the boat. But when times were desperate, they swallowed whatever they could get their hands on, Gollum style. And it was this habit of necessity that brought about the journey's great tragedy. After consuming a meal of raw seabird, Cordoba fell quite suddenly ill, and it soon became clear why. Inside the bird's stomach was the half-eaten remains of a poisonous sea snake. Cordoba survived the incident, but he was never quite the same. He started refusing food entirely, and in his already weakened state, his condition quickly deteriorated. 4 months into the journey, he passed away. Alvarenga was understandably devastated. The two men had grown quite close during their ordeal, and with Cordoba's death, Alvarenga had not only lost a friend, he'd lost his only link to humanity. The previous 4 months had been one long battle against the elements, against starvation and dehydration, and against the constant fear that the fish would wise up or the rain would stay away just a few days too long. But with the passing of Ezequiel Cordoba, Alvarenga had found himself facing off against another, far deadlier enemy: total isolation. The prospect of being alone in that desperate situation was so terrible that at first Alvarenga simply couldn't face it. He kept Cordoba's body with him in the boat, chatting away with his young friend as if he were still alive. For 6 full days he chatted to the corpse, whilst nature took its course, until he finally realized he was losing his mind. The two men had come to an agreement that should one of them die, the other wouldn't eat the body. So Alvarenga said a few quiet words of farewell to his former friend, then rolled him solemnly overboard. He wouldn't set eyes on another human being for close to a year. Of course, the oceans aren't entirely empty, and Alvarenga frequently saw ships passing by on the horizon. Container ships mostly. Colossal floating mini-cities that traverse some of the most remote parts of our planet's 139 million square miles of ocean. But despite being some of the biggest vessels in existence, container ships invariably have very small crews, usually no more than 20 to 30 people, so eyes on the ocean are limited. Alvarenga's tiny skiff was little more than a speck amongst the endless waves, and he was never spotted. It's impossible to imagine what he must have gone through as those long months ambled by. We live in an age where people won't even sit on the toilet for 5 minutes without their mobile phones, for fear of being subjected to the tyranny of boredom. Jose Salvador Alvarenga spent 10 months alone in a tiny boat with absolutely nothing. And yet, despite the hardships, the dangers, and against all the odds, he clung to life day after day, month after month. And then, one morning, his slumber was stirred by something strange, a flock of birds circling overhead. Seabirds weren't a particularly uncommon sight for Alvarenga. He'd murdered his fair share over the previous 14 months, after all. But these weren't like any seabirds he'd come to know in the past year or so. And there was good reason for that. they weren't seabirds. Alvarenga scrambled to his feet, and there, in the distance, he saw it. Land. The skiff drifted over the coral barrier that surrounded what he would later learn was Ebon Atoll, and he dived headfirst into the water. Minutes later, the waves tossed his battered body onto the beach. As bad as things had been for Jose Salvador Alvarenga, and make no mistake, they had been impossibly, unfathomably bad. That moment, falling onto the beach and feeling the sand between his fingers, must have been one of the most exquisite experienced by any human being ever. For the first time in more than a year, his feet were firmly on dry land. Ebon Atoll is a rough circle comprising 22 separate islands, and the one Alvarenga happened to have landed on, Tile Islet, was smaller than a football pitch and entirely uninhabited, but only a few meters separated from Enitok to the north, and it was there that Russell and Emmy heard his cries, bringing our story full circle. It feels a bit ridiculous to call
Nothing in
Jose
itself is known
Alvarenga
true
lucky.
justice.
But it's worth pointing out that Ebon
This is where
Atoll
it
is the
ends.
only land for at least 100 miles in any direction. It's one of the most remote places on the planet, and if his path had been just a few miles to the north or south, he'd have drifted clean past it. The next stop would likely have been the Philippines, 3,000 miles away. It's difficult to sum up a story like Alvarenga's. It's one of those things the human brain just isn't capable of comprehending, like the size of the universe or the price of beer in London. But simply, Jose Salvador Alvarenga's 438 days at sea represented one of the most remarkable moments and feats of survival. Thanks for watching. Hey, 42 here. When you think of the coolest people who ever lived, it's hard to beat the cowboys of the Old West. Pretty much everything about them is utterly iconic. Imagine spending your days crossing epic vistas and going on the hunt for Curly's gold before hitting the local saloon to cheated cards and get into gunfights. All before tipping your 10-gallon hat to the nearest prostitute and clip-clopping away into another perfect sunset. It certainly beats a stressful commute followed by 8 hours of Microsoft Excel.
Not to work for him.
The quintessential Wild West period started at the end of the American Civil War in 1865 and ended with the official closing of the frontier by the US Census Bureau in 1895. Though some scholars believe the Wild West was briefly reopened by Will Smith in 1999. During the late 19th century, thousands of settlers were crossing the US in search of fortune and glory on the new frontier. It's during this period that we first hear many of the names that still live on in infamy 150 years later, like the legendary hunter and impresario Buffalo Bill, legendary lawman Wyatt Earp, and sharpshooter Calamity Jane. But of all the famed folk and felons of the Old West, there was not a fellow more fearsome than James Butler Hickok, a man who so epitomized the Wild West that he was actually nicknamed Wild Bill. Christmas came early this year because I got gifted the new performance package by Manscaped. Let's check it out. The Lawnmower 4.0 waterproof cordless trimmer is biffed. So don't wait around, go to manscaped.com/42 to get 20% off plus free international shipping plus 2 free gifts. Your jingle balls will thank you.